30 years since the negotiations have started. Now, we needed more science, we needed more sensitization, and the world needed to know what is happening. Now it is time for action, because we have reached a point where the window is closing, and the window is closing to that farmer who needs to secure the food for their children, who needs to have clean water for drinking, and he needs to have the fiber that they require for their clothes. Now, the distance between a COP and a farmer may be very long, or may seem extremely long. But in reality, there is no COP that would be meaningful unless we have that farmer in our mind. Because the decisions that are happening there should not be disconnected from the billions of people that are still found on this earth and that are suffering day in, day out from climate change, biodiversity loss, land degradation. I'm more here to speak about land, and because this is my convention, the convention that I'm responsible for, also being conscious of the fact that there is biodiversity and climate issues around the table. So always put yourself in the shoes of that farmer, or that pastoralist, or that fisherman or woman, or that city dweller whose life depends on nature, and who are, like us, being fed by nature. We are not fed by a bank account, or we don't get our water from the tap. We get it from nature. And as long as we are not able, as negotiators in a convention and in a COP like the one in Sharm el-Sheikh, to put ourselves on that chair, we may adopt decisions and conventions that may not fit the needs of that farmer. So yeah, absolutely right. It is absolutely important that these negotiators now, Audrey, what we know is that those people that are around the table in Sharm el-Sheikh, they are all coming from Cote d'Ivoire or Malawi, so they are there to represent the farmer. So they should be able to speak on behalf of that farmer. They are elected as government, yeah. Or they are representing civil society organizations to speak for the farmer who could not be in Sharm el-Sheikh.
But to change the reality and really create sustainable agriculture or sustainable land conservation, you need investment. And if you recall, the African ministers met in Cairo in preparation for COP back in early September. And part of their communique, they called for more financing, particularly for things like sustainable supply chains in agriculture. And given the war in Ukraine and the constraints on food supply, I wanted to understand what your thinking is about our ability collectively to mobilize a lot of new investment for sustainable food supply chains.
You just touched upon a very important point, which is financing. And it is critical that the entire world understands that we need to turn a page. The Paris Agreement is not only an agreement. It's a shift that everybody should understand from the way we have been doing business so far, because business as usual is what brought us to where we are. So therefore, it is very important that all countries, rich and poor, that all people in the world understand that something is happening to us and we need to shift. We need to move towards more sustainable production and consumption. Now, funding is important. Public funding is extremely important. But let's face the reality of the world is that public money will be far from being sufficient. So it is absolutely important to maybe respond to the needs of the poorest of the poor. But the shift that is required will require mobilization of private financing, mobilization of additional funds to the public resources that most governments are referring to, especially in developing countries. So I'm not denying the fact that we need more funding. Absolutely, we need more funding on adaptation. We need more funding to respond to provide some substantive support or humanitarian aid to the poorest of the poor. But the transition that we are talking about, the economic transition, the ecological, the energetic transition that is required, will need massive financing. And energy is a business. Agriculture is a business, so it cannot be only funded by the public funds, which an ODA represent nothing compared to the resources that are needed. Now, the beauty of it is that a continent like Africa has a lot of renewables,
Yes.
solar, water, wind, hydrogen,
The ability to store carbon.
Yeah. Mr. Thiaw, before you go ahead on the solutions, I just would like to, because Nicole will raise this discussion with you around the solutions. I just would like to come back to just what you said about the public funding, because here we would like to understand why it does not work. Because at the COP, I mean, most of the participants will be the public sector, officials, ministerial level. So why the money that has been, promised by the international community, like we say, this money is not available to address these climate change problems?
I wished I have the response. I really wished I have the
So
the
what
answer
are they
to that.
going to talk about in Egypt?
In Copenhagen, there was a promise of $100 billion. This is what you are talking about. The $100 billion per year for financing for climate. That is not being delivered, and that is creating a mistrust between negotiators from the north and from the south.
Exactly.
And actually creating a division that should not have existed, because we are all being faced with the same issue. Whether you are a rich country or a poor country, you have to face climate change. Now, mistakes were made probably in the past, maybe some development patterns that were made, and there are countries that are bearing a huge responsibility there. Now, the promise has not been delivered, and that is a problem.
Is it a problem of willingness or lack of awareness?
We cannot say lack of awareness. I
Okay,
don't
so
think there is any leader in the world that doesn't know what is happening.
lack of money?
I don't want to attribute this, because I'm not a decision maker here, and I'm not but what I observe is that a promise was made and is still not delivered on. We are still $20 billion short of the $100 billion that was promised. We are getting closer, but we are not there. That is one. That being said, we should not wait until the $100 billion per year is achieved before we move to the massive transformation that is required. Because obviously, that public money is important, but even if it was delivered, would not have been sufficient in any case. Let's not fool ourselves. Or everybody, I mean, we have to just understand that an ecological transition and an energy transition and the transition that is needed will require a lot of funding. So the development patterns that as they were conceived 50 years ago needs to be reviewed. Multilateral development banks as they were conceived 50 years ago need to be reviewed. And the private sector will adapt to that. But the message that they got as private sector from Paris was to say, divest from fossil fuels and from dirty energy, invest on more renewable, more sustainable, more cleaner development path. But they have not been given all the tools as of yet, and the securities and the guarantees and the de-risking that is needed to use your pension fund, my pension fund, which is where the money is not yet secured. They are not yet safe to invest the trillions of dollars that are needed there. So the transition will need to happen all over the world. But the $100 billion promise has not been delivered. I cannot answer to your question because, unfortunately, I just observed that it is not delivered.
I leave this question to Aubrey, this question of private sector involvement in Aubrey's hands. But yes, you're absolutely right. You go ahead, Aubrey. Sorry for interruption.
No, I think that it's a good point, and I think an analogy maybe is the great infrastructure financing gap in Africa, right? It's over $100 billion a year, somewhere around that. And we know that that's never really been pledged or brought to the table, but progress is made despite that. And in fact, African governments are the largest financiers of infrastructure. Most people think it's China, but that's China as an external player. It's really African governments that have come to the table on the infrastructure that has been built, but there's still a gap remaining. So I think it's that analogy. There's going to be a gap, and we just have to make progress despite that gap. And I think often it's treated as a nice to have. I think Executive Secretary Thiaw, you probably recognized the consternation on the continent around issues of divesting from fossil fuels when some European countries have returned to fossil fuels in the wake of the Ukraine energy crisis. And that kind of the view of that kind of behavior in the name of a just transition is very difficult. So I wanted to ask you about the one project that might fall right into your wheelhouse, which is the Great Green Wall project. Talk about needing to mobilize an incredible amount of financing. Is this a dream project, or is progress being made?
It is a dream. Let's face it. The dream is to restore 100 million hectares by 2030. But you need to have big dreams in order to achieve something. The pyramids were not built would not have been built if there was no dream. Now, every single big achievement in the world was a dream first before it became reality. So the Great Green Wall was dreamt maybe 15 years ago by some people. Some would assume that they were big dreamers, but it is now becoming a reality. Now, as you probably know, billions of dollars have now been promised by international banks, international organizations, and countries are in a phase of developing proposals and in the phase of implementation. $19 billion are now being promised for 2025. We understand, according to the latest count, that 2.5 have already been spent. But we are not yet we have not reached the speed at which the spending would be completed by 2025. So there have been some bottlenecks in African countries as well, but mostly amongst international organizations that have promised this financing, because they have procedures that are very difficult to navigate. We have 8 main donors, 8 main sources of funding, and 11 countries. You go to a country like Djibouti, which is a very small country, and you ask them to navigate through the procedures of the World Bank and the African Bank and the European Union. They are unable to do that. So we are calling for institutions to actually find a way for these countries to access these resources without the stringent measures that are normally done by a country that has capacities. Because if they had capacities, probably they would not have come together to organize to develop the Great Green Wall. Now, the name for the public, the name may be misleading. The Great Green Wall is nothing else than an integrated rural development program in a desert area, in a dry land, in the margins of the Sahara, from Senegal to Djibouti. And it is important to note that this is for rural activities. The women on the ground, the young people on the ground that are tempted by migration, or those young people that may be tempted by drugs or illicit activities, should be brought to the economy. And thinking about it in that way, I think it makes sense, because you are investing on people's development, you are investing on sustainable development, and you are investing in empowering people who otherwise may flee, may have flown to next city or the next country or further afield.
May I ask you a question, Mr. Thiaw, about the people, because I know you do care about the people and not only about the concept. Even if there you are very eloquent. You have been working on the Sahel for years now. You have been, like I said, Deputy Executive Director of UNIP and Special Advisor to the Secretary General on the Sahel. About the people, the climate refugees, is it already something you are working on? Even on these areas, who are living despite the desertification, or is it? Where are we? Where do we stand on the climate refugee aspect? Even on the Congo Basin and And there's also around the Chad Lake, there's also problems related to the people. How do you appreciate the situation?
Yeah. The concept of climate refugees is controversial. It's not accepted by everybody. But the reality is that some people have to flee if their land is so degraded that they cannot generate income there. You see it not only in the Sahel, you see it in Haiti, you see it in Afghanistan, you see it in all parts of the world where land is so degraded that they cannot produce anymore, whether they were farmers or pastoralists or doing any other sorts of activity. According to some analysis, up to 70 million people may be displaced from their home to another place by 2030. That's a large, it's too much.
And where do they go?
They go to the neighboring country, they go to a neighboring region, or they travel further afield. They may go to Europe, they may go to the Middle East, they may go to Angola or South Africa. So this is a major source. You know that Cote d'Ivoire is hosting, apparently 25% of the population of Cote d'Ivoire is originating from another country. So this phenomenon is known and is studied. Now, the relationships between land degradation and migration have been documented in the world over. They may not be called climate refugees. You know that even in the United States, most of the migrants that are coming from a dry area in Latin America, because the dry corridor. So it is documented that migration or forced migration in this case, is linked to lack of opportunities to thrive in a place. And there's no fence that can stop them.
And what is the problem?
The only way they can be kept in their countries, in their regions, they are not migrating out of goodwill of just moving. They are migrating because they are forced to migrate. They have no opportunity. The only way is to help them restore the land, to help them create opportunities, and to have. This is exactly one of the narratives of the Great Green Wall that has been talking about. The only way to keep these people in their countries, in their regions, is to help them develop their own activities. Let me give you one example. People in the Sahel produce painfully to just lose half of their production for lack of conservation, for lack of energy, because it's too hot. So milk, all the perishable products should be consumed on the day or lost. So think about how you can transform that heat into cold for conservation through solar energy. So if the Great Green Wall is able to help these poor communities in the rural villages with solar energy, wind energy, and so forth, you create value chains. So instead of losing the production, they transform it, they process it, they create jobs, and then you keep young people on the ground where they originate from. So they leave because they have no opportunity. They have to feed their children, they have to feed their spouses and their parents. And this is not happening right now because there is no opportunity for them to produce anything.
Yeah, and why, tell us or remind us why it is so difficult to name them climate refugees.
It's a long discussion within the international negotiators.
Yeah.
It's not an agreed term. Let me put it in that way. So everything that is not agreed is considered as not agreed until it is agreed.
But the situation is there. Their situation is related to
forced migration exists.
Related to the climate problems.
To climate, to land degradation, to drought, and to lack of opportunities. Now, if you are living in a small island state, and that your island is likely to be submerged by the sea, you have to flee.
Yeah.
And where do you go? You go to the next possible destination for you. So these are. I think the concept of forced migration is accepted. The concept of climate refugee is not yet fully understood. But it doesn't matter. I am less concerned about semantics. What is happening is that human beings that are forced to leave their country or to leave their region to go to another place. So it's displacement. And
in the Sahel, you have also the problem of jihadist attacks. So they have several reasons to want to fly. Aubrey, you're welcome, please.
And so, sorry, Aubrey, give me a second.
You're welcome.
You just mentioned jihadists and these movements. you know that most of the people that they use are from the region. Young people that are recruited to just pose AEDs. They don't even know what it is, but they were given $200 to do it. For them, $200 is a lot of money. So they are an easy prey for terrorist groups and other people that are doing human trafficking and drug trafficking and so forth. So unless they have opportunities, they may be tempted by a small amount of money, but still is worth their life for them. So it's desperate to that point. So it is important that they are given hope and they are given opportunities to actually thrive in their own region.
Exactly.
No, I just have one follow-up question you were talking about rural development projects as part of the Great Green Wall, and you were also making the point about climate refugees. This in the United States was defined in the Dust Bowl by climate refugees internally displaced. And because of that, there were great programs that were launched in the country and public works were created. Infrastructure was built in part to employ those people. So my question is, what kind of resilient infrastructure do countries like in the Sahel need? Is it a matter of rural roads or just solar electricity? What do you think are the priority kind of resilient infrastructure projects as part of the Great Green Wall project?
Every single region, every single village will identify their own priorities. Depending on if they have a road, they will not need another road. If they have a water point, they may not need another water point. But in general, the point is to see how you can use the potentialities that are found in the Sahel. Now, by definition, the Sahel is a dry land. But many people do not know that the largest aquifers in Africa are found in the Sahara. So there is water underground. But that water is not accessible today for lack of energy. Many people do not know that this large space that is available in the Sahel can be used for agriculture, except there is no water available. So if you have energy, you can have access to water. If you have energy, you can reduce the food waste. If you have energy, you can process your food. You can create jobs. One of the biggest handicap out there is energy poverty. And it takes you away from plantations of tree planting or Great Green Wall concept as initially conceived, but it is squarely now part of the Great Green Wall initiative because it was recognized as a major development. It's like a disruptor that is absolutely important to take them to the next level of development. They have been doing the same agriculture since Egypt, since the Pharaoh.
I'm glad you brought that up. And I know my colleague here, Nicole, is going to jump in, but it just shows that electrification and the access to electricity, which 600 million Africans lack, is critical for all areas of development, including clean development and climate resilience.
Yeah. Speaking of Aubrey, I think now it's time we move to Nicole. Thank you, Nicole, for your patience here. Thank you, Aubrey, for this very interesting exchange, but feel free to jump into the conversation because you are also an expert of climate finance. So, but now maybe we can focus more on how to address all these challenges you so eloquently presented here, because there's from energy to desertification, from forced migrations to, the problem of security. You raised a lot of issues. So now I think it's important, beyond the pledges of the international community and that have not been kept, we dive into the practical solutions we may find. So Nicole, maybe over to you.
Terrific, thank you. And thanks to you and Aubrey and Secretary Thiaw for opening up and setting up so many different issues. And while we talk about solutions, I also wanted to bring in and pick up on a couple dynamics you mentioned. And in particular, we talked about the overall impact of climate change and land degradation in particular on economic growth in Africa. We've seen that anywhere from 5 to 15% of GDP has been lost. And in particular, that the the productivity challenges posed by climate change and the reduced rainfall and the drought, and then the impact that's having. And as you mentioned, in particular, the impact that that's having on young people and women, I think, is something that we want to unpack a little bit more, and especially in the context of solutions. And when we think about land and how that plays in and sort of at the heart of these opportunities, as well as those challenges. We know sub-Saharan Africa has a rising, is still rising population, and there are many constraints to economic participation and unemployment, as you say, in particular in agriculture. Access to land is a key constraint to that. Similarly, somewhere between 70 to 90% of wealth in Africa is generated through the land and agriculture, but less than 10% is owned by women. So I wanted to bring up sort of youth and women and just get a little more of your thoughts on the situation, on the particular challenges, and how in your at the policy level you're thinking about that, and then talk a little bit more about some of the other potential solutions, and get back to the finance piece as well.
Thank you, Nicole. You are bringing an issue that is dear to me. It's just I don't know how to qualify. Not fair. let me just be mild here. It is not just fair for humanity to think that 40% or 45% of your workforce does not have access to land. 45% of the smallholders are women. But probably around 10%, as you said, have access to land. They own the land. Everybody else is using the land of someone else. And as such, they do not have access to finance, to credit. They do not have access to technology, and sometimes even not access to extension. So is that how you want to define your sustainable development goals? How will you achieve development at all if half of your producers are marginalized? In addition to being unfair, it is not economically viable. So this is something that needs to be addressed in most countries in the world. So it's not specific to Africa, by the way. It's a worldwide phenomenon. What is even more shocking is that those who are using the land may be stripped from that land when they are widowed. Not only they would have lost their loved ones, but they would have lost the land, which is the only source of income for them. So they go back to their original families, and or they start doing something else in another place. So I think this is a fundamentally important issue, that land tenure and women's access to land is a very important one. Youth, this is another important topic. 2/3 of the population is less than 35, especially in the Sahel. It's a very young population. In some countries, actually, half of the population is less than 18. It's just incredible to think about it. Now, it's a challenge because they need to be educated. They need to be provided some support. But it's also an opportunity in some way, because they are creative. They are ready to engage. They want to change a narrative. They want to do something else. What is, I think, missing is a platform whereby they would be taken back to land to generate income, to produce, to create startups. There are many startups that are being created on IT, but not many on land, not many on agriculture. So it is very important, just consider the food loss that I talked about, post-harvest loss. If you have new startups that are able to fill that gap, then it's business for them. And it's actually good for the economy. It's good for the farmer. If you find young people who are able to process the food that they are producing locally, the tomato, the mango, the milk, fish, everything they catch, is actually consumed on the day or lost, or sometimes they dry it. It's called kiliji in Niger, or it can have different names. But the point is that the lack of energy, if you are able to provide them with energy, you are actually resolving a number of problems for agriculture, for health, for education, and for everybody else. So I think it's another way of thinking about development, especially rural development, because most of the time electricity is provided to cities, but rural electricity is problematic. It's very rare, only in few countries, where you have 30% electricity in rural areas. In some countries, it's 5% access to electricity in rural areas. So because electricity is conceived as lighting, not energy for development. Now, if you change that narrative and you change that concept, you are creating an economy at the rural level, instead of tempting young people to come and live in suburbs and to become a source of security issue, because they are demonstrating in the streets, they are unhappy, they are frustrated, and all of that, because they are not being given opportunity. So I think governments will have to rethink their policies and see the potential. I mean, the glass to me is half full, not half empty. So if you look at it from that perspective, I think there are lots of opportunities for young people.
And just to pick up at that, and going back to the renewables conversation that we had earlier, there's that double potential, right? Because there are so many opportunities in the renewable energy space, in particular, job opportunities and employment opportunities that can then also help bring out those economic participation opportunities in agriculture and agricultural-led economic growth. And to your point, going back to the conversation around migration and displacement and climate refugees, what we're seeing is where are a lot of these young people in particular going is to the cities, right? That is often their initial destination, whether that's in the country they're in or across border, they often go to the cities first. And so, Aubrey's point about that supportive infrastructure that enables not only productivity in land, and you talked about the technology, which will make agriculture more appealing to young people to engage in and those agribusinesses, but providing those links between the rural and the urban areas and enabling more of that manufacturing, processing beyond the subsistence agriculture, I think is really critical. And going back to one of the conversation points, that Aubrey sort of introduced in the conversation about how to make some of this policy reality and really execute on some of these commitments. When we think about inclusive land, inclusive climate action, inclusive economic growth, it's really not only about the outcomes, but about the process and the governance. And we've seen young people, women, for example, often not part of the conversation, not part of the policy making, whether that's at COP or in other settings. And so I'm curious how, when you think about, your agency and, the conversations you're planning to have at COP, how do you think about bringing women, bringing youth into the conversation so that as these policies, as these solutions continue to be developed, they are part of that conversation and part of that voice?
Mr. Executive Secretary, before you answer, I just would like to flag our people who watch right now this conversation virtually that they feel free to ask questions in the chat, because in a few minutes we'll open the discussion to our listeners. So don't hesitate to send your potential questions to Mr. Executive Secretary on the chat. Sorry.
Thank you. Nicole, most discussions I have heard so far about gender equality have been focused on elections, staffing in organizations. Hardly any discussion is held on land, on access to land. I would like to encourage those who are interested in inequalities and promoting an equal world to actually pay attention to that issue. It may be it may not be known to many, but it is one of the fundamental challenges that the world is faced with at the moment. Agriculture, especially in continents like Africa, is the main source of income. If you are depriving those people from access to land, you are actually punishing the entire family. And you are jeopardizing the education of their children, because they pay for the education of their children when they have any income. You are jeopardizing the opportunity for the country to actually change its own economic trajectory, because you are basically marginalizing half of the producers. So I would like to encourage, not only they should be on the table, but they should actually grab the agenda. I mean, women should grab this agenda. And what we would like to do is to see institutions like, not only at the national and regional level, but global institutions like the MDBs, to actually change their guidelines for funding of projects, rural development projects, because they do not seem to have that lens. We would like to see the United Nations, including the United Nations, the UN Women and other actors, to actually have a campaign about women's access to land, because it is a real problem. You know, in 108 countries, women are disinherited when they are widowed. In 100, I mean, it's just unimaginable. So I think this issue should be better known to many and be addressed properly.
May I ask a question, Nicole, if you give me the authorization very quickly. Mr. Executive Secretary, you are in charge of the combat against desertification, and it is not only on the African continent, it's everywhere in the world, yeah. And particularly in southern countries, the land has a cultural value and belongs to traditions. Often it's a legacy, and there's something related even to religious practices. So how, it's not only related to global change, that's what I mean. How do you address this matter, these cultural aspects? Even in South America, there is a fight for taking back the lands from those who took those lands, and people talk about justice around this matter. So how do you address this social and cultural and even religious matter?
Okay, I'll start with the religious, because most of the time the religion is used as an excuse. It doesn't say so. And the interpretation is probably done by those who want to continue the domination. So debunk that myth. That's my message. Second is cultural issues exist. And that culture also needs to be reviewed and questioned, because in this world, in this modern world, you cannot just keep telling me that this is culture. No, a number of issues are being questioned, and this should be one of them. Just the status quo or the business as usual is not in favor of change. So it may come from policies at the national level. It may come from support by the international organizations to bring that policy. It may be through. Now, what I have seen is that in order to break that silo, you actually sometimes you need to bring modernity. So the culture itself does not resist to modernity. So if you have modern programs that are dedicated to women's development, and I have seen in many countries where gardens, women's gardens were created and so forth, no one is questioning that because it's modern. And the culture does not come to confront that because it is recognized as being a modern approach. So maybe it's the way it should be introduced. Now, I'm sure many organizations will find a niche on how this what I'm doing today is just to put it on the table as an issue that needs to be addressed. The last thing I want to hear is to say that it is not possible to change it. Yes, it is possible to change it. Yes, it is possible to address all sorts of complex issues. It may take time, but not addressing it is not a solution.
Nicole, you're welcome. Excuse me.
Oh, no, thank you. It's a terrific question. I just wanted to get back to climate finance, and then I know we're coming up on time, and we might hear from the audience, but I wanted to just come back to the climate finance issue, because I think the additional contextual point going into COP that we should think about is that public and private finance in the emerging markets, developing economies, the EMDs, has tightened significantly, in particular within the last year, in response to interest rates rising, in response to high inflation. We're seeing sovereign debt on the rise, as well as corporate and including even small, medium-sized enterprise debt and non-performing loans. And that translates, conveys into the agriculture sector as well. And it's a real concern. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that as you think about this. And Aubrey, please certainly weigh in on things you've seen. Worth noting, my colleague Manuel Bueno at APT has recently put out a really interesting paper looking at climate finance in this high interest rate world. And going back to that inclusive conversation that we just had, how do you think about, or what are you seeing as far as the financing solutions, especially in this context and climate, and getting that money into the smallholder farmers, right? And whether that's identifying the microfinance solutions. Happy to share some thoughts from some of our experience in Egypt on USAID Feed the Future project. But wanted to put that out there because, again, I think it's that connecting the dots between large-scale investment in climate finance, and as you just rightly said, the significant share that's really dominated by the smallholder farmers, and in particular, wanting to try to get the financing into the hands of women or young people who are traditionally face the most challenges in gaining access to finance, access to credit, and then to that land. So I wanted to bring that out.
Thank you for that question. Now, most of the time when people speak about climate finance, they think about mitigation and technology, because that's where the bulk of the money is going. Today, I would like us to think about the 3.2 billion people in the world that are affected by land degradation. Today, I would like us to think about the 500 million people that live of pastoralism and rangelands and grasslands that are not even considered as being part of the solution. They are part of the solution. Today, I would like us to think about solutions that are provided by nature that are complementary to the solutions that would come from technology, essentially from renewable energy and clean energy. So when we speak about climate finance, I would like us to look at the entire spectrum and not focus on just one aspect of it. As important as it is, decarbonization is not the only solution. So I really would like, this will probably come to, again, to Sharm el-Sheikh, because there are lots of people who are requesting that there should be more money on adaptation. Now, money on adaptation is not only public money. The private sector will have to invest on adaptation to adapt to climate change. You need to adapt your agriculture. You need to test your investments in terms of forestry management, in terms of agriculture and food and fish and on and so forth. All of that will need to be looked at from the financial point of view, public and private. But my message to you, my response to your question, Nicole, is to say yes, public finance is an issue. Public finance is an issue if you only think about the public money. Climate finance may not be an issue if public money and MDBs are able to de-risk investments to mobilize additional private financing, because the bulk of the money will come from private financing. But there is a minimum of investment from the public sector that will de-risk these investments. So that conversation will continue to happen, and there are more and more calls for reform of MDBs, including the World Bank and African Development Bank and Asian Bank, so as to have that mindset of de-risking larger investments that will generate more private investments. Then we will have a transition, and a clean transition. At the moment, people are going back to coal, as Audrey said earlier, which is not acceptable.
Thank you very much.
I was just, if I can just pick up on that, it's such an important point. And
we have a few seconds, and
apologies.
to ask questions, to take the questions from the audience. But if you can ask your question very briefly, and Mr. Executive Secretary, please very briefly answer so we can give them the possibility to speak. Go ahead.
Sure. It was actually just to weigh with an example, to say that, as I mentioned, that our colleagues in Egypt, through a USAID funded project, are working to leverage that funding to get bank financing to co-develop products specifically tailored to those smallholder farmings, to get those financing products and partnerships with banks that are leading to those lending. So there are real world examples of that coming together. And just to agree, and just on the reforming the World Bank and those international finance institutions, that's something that we are looking closely at in the Geoeconomic Center. And going back to what I was saying about that inclusive governance and bringing in the private sector as well. Back to you, Ambassador Yade, for an audience question.
Thank you very much, Nicole. I appreciate your smart and very interesting questions. I would like to give them the possibility to ask a few questions. There is a few questions here, but maybe given the time we have, the global mood, Mr. Executive Secretary, is when will we stop the talks and go to action? And one of these questions related to that is how can the actors have access to the pledges? We wish, Mr. Jean Jag says, we wish we would be informed about the procedures to get access of the pledges. I mean, the financial, where are they located? IFDB, the World Bank, or Bezos Foundation. We know that Bezos promised a lot around the Grid Green Wall. So how do you appreciate, and you mentioned that, how the link can be done between these organizations who make pledges and the local actors who would like to implement the solutions?
Yeah. Most of these pledges are done through governments. So it is important that people would hold their governments accountable. And second, there may be some projects that may float through NGOs and other institutions. And again, the information should go through the channel of the government or civil society organizations if they have global, regional, or national networks. I'm sure this will be also a channel for information. But it's that impatience that I hear. When are we going to move from talks to action is absolutely understandable, and I fully support that, because we have talked a lot and we have had COPs and every year, and people are tired of this.
For 30 years.
And every year you have new reports saying exactly the same. Just today, new reports were issued from 5 or 6 organizations, all pointing to the fact that we are at a trajectory of 2.5 degrees, not 1.5. But when are we going to have action, and when this trend is going to change? So that pressure should continue to be pushed on government, because it's essentially governments and the major emitters, essentially. So I think it is important that people would continue to put these questions, and not only to actually manifest it through their own means, democratic means.
Among these means, there is a question here from somebody who seems to be French, Céline. To what extent, sorry for the question, so will COP27 address the issue of climate change accountability? That person is saying, is mentioning the United States, who accounts for 25% of global emissions, whereas the entire African continent contributes less than 3%. And she's saying, why don't you think that if people who are responsible for this pollution are accountable, don't you think that it will expedite or accelerate the access to the funding?
I do not see the link, but she has a very good point. People have to be accountable for their action. and they are responsible. Those who are responsible for the pollution should pay. This is the climate justice that is being called for by everybody. But we also need to be aware of the fact that countries that may not have contributed to climate change will have to put their own resources to protect themselves, because money will not only be coming through development cooperation channels. It is important that budget lines in every single budget, and there are countries are doing it, by the way. It's not that they are sleeping and waiting for someone to do it for them, but unfortunately we have to face climate change because it is a worldwide phenomenon.
Thank you very much. I think we are we're arriving at the end of our conversation. Very, very interesting. A lot of people are asking to have access to the recording because you provided so many information, and thank you for your professional analysis of the situation and the convictions behind. You have been preceded by your reputation, and very good reputation, and we are very honored and happy to have you speak so well about these very tough and difficult questions. We thank you, Nicole and Aubrey, for your insights in this conversation, and we really appreciate the large topics you have covered from the Africa Center and from the Geoeconomic Center with Nicole. So stay tuned. Mr. Executive Secretary, we wish you a very good stay in Washington, D.C. And we hope to see you very soon. I guess you will be in Egypt in a few weeks.
Yes, indeed.
And good luck. Maybe sometimes, this time it will be different from the previous times, like you said. Fingers crossed. Thank you, and stay tuned.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye, Nicole.